how do you start thinking about this as a possible feature film, as a possible subject for a feature film?
At the time, so when we were discussing and when we were designing the project, way back in 2015, a number of events happened in Malta, which were really focusing on women, on two particular situations involving women. There was one situation where a Lithuanian, I believe, or Latvian woman was arrested and fined for dancing in a bikini near I think it was a banda during the Stella Maris Festa.
That's right.
I think I remember that.
Yes, I do remember that.
Could have been insensitive.
That's my parish,
yes, exactly. Could have been slightly culturally insensitive for her to do it, but we thought it was a bit of a bit of an exaggeration. Mm-hmm. Within the same maybe month, there was a woman, a Muslim woman, who wanted to swim in a burkini in a private sports club, and she was denied the right to swim with her burkini on the grounds of lack of hygiene, etc., etc., etc. So we started carrying out a little bit of research. This is just in the beginning, and we were made aware, actually through a MaltaToday article, of the request by the then Archbishop Mikhail Gonzi in the 1960s, who sent a letter to the Prime Minister Boris Oliver to institute a morality police based on a number of issues. One of them being the immorality that he was seeing on public beaches, mainly bikinis. Mm-hmm. So we were a bit...
The swinging 60s.
We were always thinking, okay, swinging 60s, we're discussing women in bikinis. 2014-15, we're still discussing what women should wear. Or not wear, whether it's covered or uncovered. Sort of, where's the reaction? And we wanted to know where the reaction was.
We were not allowed to wear a bikini. And to do that, we used to have to do it in secret.
Watching this documentary, I discovered, because I had no idea about this, that, back in the 70s, that's, good 40 years ago, there were a number of very active, quite brave organizations that really kind of set the ball rolling. And we obviously interviewed some of the protagonists. This kind of creates this uncomfortable notion when you're watching the film that there seems to have been more resistance and awareness, and this might be a reflection of how much more serious the issue was at the time, than there is today. Do you think women have sort of stepped back in a sense since those days?
Yes, in fact, when we were researching, our initial thought was to focus on the 60s, just 60s and now, to make a kind of comparison. But when we were interviewing people, we realized that the movements in the 70s and 80s should definitely not be ignored, because they were the main protagonists, as you're saying, in the history of, maybe recent history of Maltese female movements, barring today.
There doesn't seem to have been anything before, so...
Not much before.
So you can really trace the origin to...
Exactly. Of course, we have to look at it, in the context of what was going on in Europe in the 70s as well.
The discourse about women's rights started rather late here in Malta.
A Malta sono arrivata nel 78 e poi nell'80 è cominciato il Minnahat Nisa, il gruppo delle donne. Mi ricordo che avevo 80 perché nel 1980 era un anno bisestile e c'erano i commenti della gente intorno che dicevano cominciate nell'anno bisestile, giusto, perché l'anno bisestile è l'anno in cui è permesso alle donne di pensare.
Yes.
So it was kind of part of that whole maybe global movement. Mm-hmm. But we did as well question, when we were researching, we did question, say, okay, what happened in the 90s? In the 2000s, in the early 2000s, there seems to have been a kind of lull, which is now picking up again now. However, if we see what they were discussing in the 70s and what we're discussing in very recent history, they're pretty similar. We're talking divorce, mm-hmm. which, let's face it, came in, 5 years ago, mm-hmm. 6 years ago. We're talking family control, family planning clinics. Mm-hmm. So over here, we're talking again about birth control. Mm-hmm. So they're pretty similar issues. And somehow it's a bit, you take a step back and you're like, okay, so what have we done in these 40 years?
Emerges strongly from the documentary is the sort of the sheer power of the figure of the Archbishop at the time, Gonzi. Even the wording of the letters that you quote in the documentary. He talks to the Prime Minister like he's talking to a schoolboy. Yeah. It gives you the impression, I don't want to, but at the end of the day, in the 70s, the power sort of balance had changed. There was a different archbishop who was nowhere near as sort of formidable as Gonzi. Gonzi was not on the scene anymore. So could it be argued, and obviously throughout the documentary we're talking about Malta being very patriarchal in a way I don't think anyone can realistically deny, but is it a case that they had to wait until this great, strong patriarchal force had sort of faded from the scene before these movements could even happen? Well, is it the case that in the 60s it was just not possible because the patriarchal side of things was too strong?
It was very strong, but I think I think in the 60s there was that shift. There was a general shift, between the old and the young. So there was the whole, swinging 60s, there wasn't a very strong vocal movement, but I mean, girls those days anyway wore bikinis, maybe in secret, but they wore them on beaches.
And miniskirts.
Miniskirts. There was a kind of a very quiet one. I mean, women going out to work anyway, even though they were really not allowed to, women smoking in public, women driving cars. So there was a kind of very quiet
that was
resistance.
Shocking to me. I mean, there was actually a fuss about women driving cars.
At that time, women, I'm sorry to say, were not given so much importance. I still remember women that they were good teachers, but when they get married, they have to stop their job.
So, I mean, I'm not sure whether it has anything, to do with Gonzi himself as a figurehead, or whether it has to do with what as well is going on around us in the world. But also, I think in the 70s there was also like a very huge social shift as well. What with Mintoff, what with all the other...
The political structure.
The political structures changed. Although, as we can see in these 40 years, the main figureheads in Maltese society are men.
In fact, it was one of the questions. I'll be careful how I word it because it could be misinterpreted. I don't want to sound like I'm being unfair on Maltese women, but we can't help but notice when you look at, the personalities that have emerged, especially in politics. And politics is important here because this is the legislative issues we're talking about.
Of course.
The only things that can change this are, in fact, political processes.
Of course, definitely.
And overwhelmingly, the sort of the formidable, powerful figures that we've brought up with are very authoritarian. We mentioned Mintoff, Edi Fenech-Adami, perhaps less authoritarian, but like a sort of immensely powerful within the context of time. We're all men, and there hasn't, to the best of my knowledge, been an equivalent sort of matriarchal figure to counterbalance that. So, would you say that's part of the issue is that we've kind of been inured to associate power with men over the centuries, over the millennia, probably?
Well, I mean, that definitely, obviously.
Yes. But how strong and difficult is it to break?
I think it's difficult to break because, the changes are relatively recent. I mean, the whole the signing of CEDAW, which is the huge convention that changed things in '93.
These are all very recent.
Very recent. However, although, and I might be jumping a bit, although when we talk about, feminism, women's movements in Malta, everyone's like, okay, so why? Of course you're equal now, the laws have changed, you're equal. You don't need a feminist movement, there's no need for it. But if you look at the figures, the rate of employment of women is one of the lowest in Europe. If we look at full-time workers, only 16% of candidates were women in the last election, 16%. And it is a bit, to me, a bit shocking. There's one minister out of 14 who's female, 8 parliamentarians, members of parliament out of 69. So obviously there is a kind of, there's a definite imbalance. Where does it stem from? It stems, I believe, from the old, maybe patriarchal system that doesn't see women as being maybe strong enough.
But in politics, there is, being a democracy and everything else, the people who get elected are also a reflection of popular perceptions. Interestingly, you mentioned that 16% of candidates in the election were female. If you look at the rate of how many of them actually get elected on the basis, I'm going to explain this very well because mathematics isn't my strong, but proportionally, it's actually not it's not low.
The success rate is high.
Success rate is high when you compare to a very small amount of participation. So this suggests that Maltese electorate, male, female, whatever, doesn't have an issue with voting for female candidates. It's just that there aren't that many to vote for.
True. Because when we were doing our research, we did realize that although the numbers of candidates are relatively low, the success rate of electing such candidates are quite high. However, I'm not sure whether there is an active movement within the bigger parties to recruit female candidates. which might be part of the issue.
Sorry, one could turn the question around and say, well, isn't it the case that women are keeping back? Isn't it the case that women are stepping forward? But then, as you're saying, our party is looking for women. I mean,
You know, I think it could be a bit of both, that women are maybe not empowered enough in sense in themselves to feel like they can actually go for it. I don't think there's a lack of interest per se, I think. But I think, I would think that seeing that the success rate is so high for female candidates, if I was in a political party, I would definitely look for more female candidates, 50-50.
so do we trust, well, once these women are getting elected successfully, are they being entrusted enough?
Yeah, well, yes, it's an interesting question, and if you look at maybe even, I mean, not just this government, even previous governments, they sort of get the soft ministries, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
You know, they
No,
get,
in fact, it was in the back of my mind as well. Social policy,
you know, social policy, civil liberties. I mean, should there could be? I mean, why shouldn't there be a prime minister? Why shouldn't there be a foreign secretary? Why shouldn't there be a minister for finance, a police commissioner? I know that's not a political party. Why
no,
not?
But it's very, but now that
rector.
you mention it, there's never been a female rector, has there?
No.
No, there is a tendency to look at those. I don't want to generalize because
I know these are
I
gross.
certainly wouldn't want to say that whoever gets the position is not valid for it.
Definitely not.
But there is a tendency to just assume. I have to admit I find myself guilty of it as well. I mean, I just worry if somebody tells me picture a police commissioner, a man would come to my mind.
And if you notice, even how maybe journalists sort of report the news, a female doctor, mother of two.
Yeah,
As in male doctor,
father
father of,
No,
whatever,
we don't
you
say
know.
that, no,
There's nothing wrong, as in the sense, there's nothing wrong in saying that you're a parent or whatever, but it's usually the fact that you're female and that you're a mother and that you're working is always kind of linked to your second profession being
in fact,
lawyer, doctor.
I can build on what you just said, and it's sort of not a pretty thing because there's another side to that, and it is, a woman, female mother of two, is reported in that way when she's, alive and kicking. The only time we'll ever mention the man was a father of two is if he died in an accident, father of two, poor children. But I mean, if it was reporting on something he did when he was alive, that would not be mentioned, it would not be considered relevant. And one of the things that you can't help but note is how very much the country's changed since then, at a very superficial level. I mean, there's the interview with Mr. Terribile, who talks about the days when his women were waterfall-detta.
Yeah.
Now, I always associated that with the 19th century, and it turns out that, and there were photos which were very clearly taken in the 60s. There was the issue of women, perhaps this was not talked about so much, but I mean, wearing the veil to go to Mass, for instance, and that was till to the mid-60s, to the Vatican Council too. And there, you look at sort of even photos from that era, and there seems to have been a certain segregation. And David talks about this. You wouldn't see. Yeah. I can't remember what David also said this, but or Maria Grey Ganado, I believe, said that for a woman to be seen having a coffee with another man
yes.
Is enough to be used as evidence against her for infidelity, which is really quite stunning. And yet, all these years. These years later, on that score, I look around Malta today and I don't see much of that. So perhaps coming back to your earlier point when you were quoting women saying that perhaps we don't need feminism, do you think that these kind of superficial advances have created this perception that, it's okay now because women can have coffee with men and not get arrested?
Yeah. Yes, obviously there have been, great changes. The thing is that although there have been huge strides in the sort of the legislative changes, this kind of superficial level, when we actually look at the figures, it actually remains pretty much stable, standard, stagnant, I would say. Although looking at sort of more female graduates, much more female graduates, better grades. So I think even if we look at what went on very recently globally, with the Women's March, women's marches across the globe, there is obviously still something that needs to be done, that needs to be spoken about, which is the fact that maybe equality, or definitely equality, has not yet been achieved. There's still that glass ceiling, and we heard a lot about glass ceilings and breaking them, or not breaking them. So I think what we saw when we actually were researching was that, okay, things have changed. We have the internet. Women can go out to work if they wanted to, but they don't that much. it's still a relatively patriarchal society, as we were seeing from many of the, in the film we interviewed many of very recent activists and academics, and they say it's alive and well patriarchy in Malta.
Yes, they do.
So it's still, and if you speak to women on a day-to-day basis, they are still faced with a number of barriers.
Fast forward all these years, nobody now is going to object to bikinis. Which is not to say that there aren't other issues about the role of women, which are a little less sort of direct and in your face, but perhaps more complicated. And the morning after pill is the one that springs to mind, because it seems to me that the resistance that we encountered is very similar on a certain level to the resistance of the 60s, to the mentality of the 60s, because it reflects sort of a question of it's a question of what women are expected to be like, and the idea that you can have control over your sex life, which is pretty standard and accepted as far as I can see everywhere else, seems to still be a problem for lots of people, and which includes women, of course, because some of the more vocal critics have in fact been women. So do you think that we have perhaps resolved these issues on a very surface level when it comes to things like what women wear up to a point, but in actual terms of how they live their lives, there is still the same underlying concern?
Definitely. If you see how the discussions evolved, it's less. There was less concern about the well-being of women per se than the woman as something to be kind of controlled. This is the way you should live your life. This is the way you should control your sexuality.
I'm rather fascinated. Why are people so afraid of women having more control and women having more power? Why are some women afraid of that, for example?
I think because maybe it questions their own belief, in what they think is the way women should act. So if you're saying women have the freedom to do what they want, in the sense they can control their fertility, their sex life, they can go out to work, they can be what they would like to be, without the strict, clear rules that were there in the past, then I think it kind of rocks the foundations of what they would fundamentally believe in. And we saw as well that when there was as well in the 90s, when there was the partnership in marriage proposals, the signing of the CEDAW, the most vocal critics were women as well. It's quite clear when we see the discussions relating, when we see the discussions relating to women as such in Malta, there's still that imagery that woman, mother, obedient, good.
Yes, I forgot the obedient. Very
obedient is very important.
I forgot that one.
You have to be a good girl. You could go to university, of course. You need to pass your exams, but then you're going to become a mother, and you should be good and stay home. Nothing wrong with staying home. Don't get me wrong, but you should have you should be encouraged to do both and supported to do both if you wanted to. Obviously, and then on the flip side, there's the nasty bad woman that's always being pointed at. The single mother. Oh, she's nasty. She does this, she does that. She goes wearing this. She paints her nails although she's unemployed. Blah blah. Which is kind of always pointing at women. You're either this or you're nasty, which I think is a bit of a. I think it's a bit of a reflection of the way we see women as a kind of, you need to be this way as opposed to that. I just want to say that when we talk about, as in when we as well discuss equality, men shouldn't be ignored at all, because obviously when we discuss feminism, it means equality for both. So there can never be equality for women if men are not given sort of parental rights too.
Okay, this brings up an issue, because one idea that is very often floated out, and I'll reserve my own judgment on it because I don't know, I haven't thought about it enough, is the idea of quotas. If for the we've already pointed out that first of all political representation is very low. I would say at a glance, I can't produce the statistics, but I'm pretty convinced the statistics will bear me out, that career decision making roles, sort of, we're talking chairpersons of boards, executive managers or directors are, overwhelmingly men, I would imagine. And in order to address this, and this is becoming a European issue now, because there is pressure on Malta to do something about
because we're always at the bottom.
Yes, on this level, yes, it would appear that we are. Would you, so coming back to your point about you shouldn't achieve equality at the risk of unbalance, would quotas, what's the argument for quotas? Let's start.
Well, I mean, the argument for quotas would be that if there's a patriarchal system that is very strong, like it is in Malta, then it's really difficult to break the cycle. And how do you break a cycle? You would break a cycle by imposing something, such as a quota, for example. So quotas in Parliament, quotas on your electoral lists, say 20%, 15%, well, 30% need to be women. So that would eventually bring the idea that women should be on these boards, should be in decision-making positions, and should be candidates for elections. Of course, the argument against would be why, I mean, I'm there for my own brain and not because I am a woman, which I get, because it's...
there is a danger that...
There is a danger.
You end up appointed to that role specifically just because of
your gender. At a certain point, something needs to be done. Whether it's through legislation or whether it's through soft law, kind of, in the sense, childcare centres. Let's not always talk about children, and because it annoys me just talking about children and feminists, and you know what I mean. Or maybe men would be more vocal, like we want these rights too. We want paternity leave, again, jumping on the children, but it might change through those attitudes. I don't know if the imposition of quotas would be the right way to go, to be honest. But there definitely something needs to be done.